Anyways, yeah, so welcome everyone. If you want to go back to there. So we'll just get started just because we have a lot to cover, and last time we didn't get through it, which is why we're here today. So I'm going to keep the intro short, but if you did miss it last time, I'm glad you could make it this time. And my name is Zoe. I am the Outreach and Volunteer Coordinator, Manager at SALT, and I'm here today with Fred Borman and Phil Auger, who are both very experienced foresters. I think from reading their bios last time, I think they have a combined over 80 years of experience in forestry, which is pretty wild. So
that was Fred alone.
So they have a wealth of knowledge. They've worked all over the state of New Hampshire. Fred's done a lot of work in Connecticut as well. Both of them have worked for the extension, and Phil was actually a staff member at SALT for a while, if those of you remember. So keeping it short, just a few how-tos for those of you that aren't super familiar with Zoom. You can ask questions two ways. You can ask in the chat box, you'll see down in the bottom right corner. And if you prefer to ask a question verbally, you can raise your hand and I can allow you to talk. On the chat, it defaults to just send a message to the panelists. So if you want to share with everybody, you just kind of use the drop down and go to all panelists and attendees. The silly feature, I don't know why I did that. So, and other than that, I will be tracking the questions as we go. We'll pause here and there, and I'll be keeping a list so we can we'll hopefully have time at the end to go over everything. So I think I'm seeing a question already about the slides being larger. That's your settings. So to make it larger, you would go up to, and you can enter full screen mode by clicking the little kind of broken square up in the top right. And you can also, if you hover between where the slides are and where our little boxes are, you can pull that line over to make the slides as big as possible. But your settings are up to you to decide. So, and that is, I think that's all I got. I think we should just dive right in. We've got 35 or so people here, so I think everyone's ready to go.
Okay.
Okay.
So we ended, or we were about to begin the discussion about beech, and Fred is going to grab that right off now.
Okay, thank you, Phil. Well, welcome back, those of you who joined us last week, and if you weren't with us last week, welcome. One recap from last week is when we talk about the branching patterns, they're either opposite branched or alternate branched. And if you remember the acronym MADCAP horse, maple, ash, dogwood, capricii, and horse chestnut, those are the opposite branch species. The other ones we'll be talking about and that we talked about last week are alternate branch. So the first tree we're going to cover today is American beech, a very common tree in New Hampshire. It's a very shade tolerant species, meaning that it will grow in the shade of other species of trees. You'll notice on the first picture here that the tree on the left has some dark spots, wounds in the tree, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but American beech is an easy tree to identify in the woods. Even the mature trees should have a smooth gray bark, not just the main trunk, but the branches as well. Next, Phil. Marcescence means that certain species will hold on to their leaves even in the wintertime. If you look at the oak on the left, you can see that the oak leaves are darker Quite a few species of oak, when they're young, will hold on to their leaves in the wintertime. The one on the right, the beech, is a little more common. You'll notice that they're a light tan. As they dry out, they become sort of translucent, and they will be pushed off by the new growth next spring. If you look through, if you go in the woods and you see the tree on the right, you'll notice in the understory, in a lot of cases where there are beech growing, that you'll be able to easily identify it because of the leaves being held onto the tree. Next. So I mentioned the dark spots on the gray bark of beech. Unfortunately, beech is very susceptible to a disease called beech bark disease. If you look at where my finger is pointing on the right, you see those little tiny white flecks. That's the beech bark scale. And each one of those tiny little flecks is an insect that is feeding under the bark of the beech tree. And while they're feeding, they're injecting the beech bark disease into the cambium of the beech tree, so that when a tree starts to get infected, you start to see these black wounds on the left. And this is where the wood, the cambium underneath the bark, has died. And so, unfortunately, this is a very common occurrence. It's very rare to see a beech tree now that is not affected by beech scale and beech bark disease. I just saw a question about whether beech bark disease is native to the United States, and I'm not entirely sure. Phil, do you know the answer to that one?
It's introduced, and the introduction is the insect, the scale insect, and it was introduced into Nova Scotia. So kind of unusual that the Canadians gave us this one, but it wasn't their fault. It came from originally, I think, from Asia. And this was a really early exotic invasion. This came, I think, in the 1890s through Halifax. I'm not sure how it came in, you know, what it was transported in on. But now this has caused a slow spread. This insect doesn't move very fast, but it does move. And the disease has moved west. I think it's now hitting Ohio, and it's moved quite far south. It's down into Virginia in that region. Beech has a really extensive range in the eastern part of the country. And it's really, this is a disaster for mature trees, as Fred said.
Thanks, Phil. If you ever want to find out the range of different species of trees, you can go online and look up Silvics of trees of the United States, and it's put out by the U.S. Forest Service, and it will include maps for all the different species that shows you what the native range is of those species. It's really a very nice publication. As Phil said, this was an introduced insect and disease. The reason it's so pervasive and damaging is that our native species, like the emerald ash borer, like the Asian longhorn beetle, and like a lot of the fungal diseases, our native species do not have a resistance to these insects and diseases that the trees in the native range of the insect or disease might have. So the best example I can think of is chestnut, American chestnut. And so, you know, up until the 1800s, late 1800s, early 1900s, the forests of eastern United States were full of American chestnut. I've heard stories of people girdling oak trees to release chestnut trees. And today that would be a cardinal sin for a forester to do something like that. So keep that in mind when you see trees that are diseased. It's most likely from an introduced species. Next. So beech is an alternate leafed, alternate branch species. If you look at the top picture, the beech buds are very distinct. They are long, tightly furled and pointed, and it's very easy to find them. Even when you have the leaves hanging on in the wintertime, you'll be able to see the buds of a beech tree. The twigs, like the bark, are gray. Unfortunately, we don't have many healthy beech, so you're going to find that the bark is wounded, has these concave depressions where the cambium has died. And so, and we've already mentioned that the disease was introduced, and it causes the bark to crack and decay organisms come in and infect the tree. So again, it's very easy this time of year to spot an American beech in the woods. Go ahead, Phil.
Okay, on to one of my favorite trees, Shagbark Hickory. And this photo is from the Burley farm, where if folks have a chance to visit it, or if you have been, you know that when you walk into the property right behind the kiosk near the farmhouse, there's a row of some really impressive shagbark hickories right there. In fact, this is one of those trees. And as you walk through the forests on the Burley forest, it's just full of a lot of beautiful, stately shagbark hickories. One of our more spectacular deciduous trees. The twigs are really, they're quite stout, robust is the word used here. And they have this very large terminal bud. So the bud is right on the end of the twig. And you'll notice, if you remember our discussion about buds, that some buds are naked, but other buds, the more typical is that they have scales. And the shagbark hickory terminal bud, the end bud, has these large scales. And the ones that are on the far outside are peeled back a little bit, kind of like the bark, which peels impressively, but they stay on over the winter. And that's one of the tricks to be able to differentiate shagbark hickory from its cousin, pignut hickory, which we also find in New Hampshire. So that those outer scales on the buds stay on all winter, fall off when the bud starts to lengthen in the spring. We have really 3 hickories in New Hampshire. This one is far and away the most common. It's usually found on good soils, though we do also see it, interestingly, on some of the heavy marine sediments, those clays that we have along the coast and up and down some of our more southeasterly towns. So we'll frequent those sites. Pignut hickory, we tend to see on ledgier uplands, rocky, high ground, and it usually isn't as impressive as shagbark hickory. The other one, bitternut hickory, which is also on the Burley farm, by the way, but bitternut hickory is actually quite a rare tree in New Hampshire. It really is only in the very southernmost towns in the state on very good forest soils. This is one of those trees in terms of distribution that shakes out really quickly as you move north in New Hampshire. It really, shagbark hickory is the most common one, but we don't see it very far up in, even in Stratford County. It starts to disappear at about Rochester, I would say, and points north of that, you just won't find it. And it's that way right across the state. So it's a southern New Hampshire tree.
I'm just going to interrupt to make sure. Can everybody see the slide that's up right now that says black walnut? Is that what everyone's seeing? I had one person who seems to be flagged. You just want to write yes or no in the chat, that would be helpful. Okay, it looks like everyone's good. All right, carry on.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zoe. So let's talk about black walnut for a minute. This is an introduced species. Quite a few people have planted them over the years. It does require a deep, rich loam soil. This particular tree is also at Burley Farm, right beside the house as you come in the driveway. So it would be an easy one to identify. One thing, I don't know if we mentioned it last week, but when you look at the twigs of a tree, the shape and texture and size of the twig is also a good identifier. That last slide that Phil showed of the Shagbark Hickory has a very thick, stout twig. Horse chestnut has a stout twig, and black walnut also has a stout twig. You might be able to see the leaf scar. We mentioned leaf scars last week, and black walnut is another species where you can see the leaf scar as you can with other species like horse chestnut. And then the bundle scars are the little tiny dots where the vascular system of the tree. But you can see that the black walnut has a cluster of buds at the terminal. I would say that is a pseudo-terminal bud as opposed to a terminal bud like you'd find on an ash or a maple tree. You can see that the bark is furrowed. If you looked at it from a distance, you might think it was an ash tree, except for the fact that it has alternate branching rather than opposite branching. What else can we say about, oh, next slide, yeah. So black walnut trees, this is, Sarah had a question. Shagbark hickory and black walnut have what are called compound leaves. An oak leaf or a maple leaf is a simple leaf. A compound leaf would be one that has a long petiole with several leaflets along the edge of the branch of the twig. And so black walnut, shagbark hickory, all of the hickories have compound leaves. Black walnut, butternut also has compound leaves. Tree of heaven, ailanthus, the tree that grows in Brooklyn, also has compound leaves. The other noticeable thing about black walnut is if you look closely at this twig where we've peeled off the outer bark into the pith, black walnut and butternut have a chambered pith. If you look closely, you'll see little lines in amongst the chocolate colored area of the center of the twig. Butternut has a buff or tan colored chambered pith. Black walnut has a brown or chocolate pith. But you can notice again how stout that twig is that we show this example of. Butternut, unfortunately, which is our native tree, is endangered because of a butternut canker. And as it says here, the bark is lighter colored and the pith is a light tan and the buds are also naked, meaning no scales. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, just a note on this before we leave. We would have preferred to show butternut stick to the native species, but butternut was almost listed federally as an endangered species because of the butternut canker. It's just about wiped the species out. In states where the tree is much more common, some of the states have imposed restrictions on cutting the tree and harvesting it. Both of these trees make black walnut, in fact, is, I think it's still, in terms of value, the highest value standing tree for its lumber of any of our species in North America. We don't grow good black walnut even if we try in New Hampshire because of our late season frosts. But butternut is another tree that has absolutely gorgeous wood. It's a little different than black walnut. And unfortunately, that's going to disappear, I think, from this canker.
Not before you go to the black gum, the other thing about black walnut, and one of the reasons it doesn't grow very well here is that black walnut has a taproot, whereas most tree species have wide, broad, laterally spreading roots. Black walnut does have a taproot, so it needs a good, deep, rich soil, like you'd find in the Ohio River Valley or Illinois and states like that, where they have, topsoil that's 30, 35 feet deep, as opposed to our 6 to 18 inches of topsoil in New Hampshire.
If you're lucky to have 6 inches.
Yeah.
So on to one of our more interesting trees, and this is black gum, or tupelo, it's called, more commonly in other parts of the country. And these first slides here are of a tree on the Mass Road property in Selt property in Epping. And this is the largest black gum tree in the state. And it really is impressive. Usually black gums aren't that impressive. We're again this is a tree that we're at the northern edge of its range. It can also be found as far south as way down in Florida, way over in Texas, so it has a large range. But here in our part of its range, it's restricted to wetlands, and very often we find it in what are called basin swamps. It's a pretty easy tree to identify. First, you've got that site requirement. It's going to be in that wetland. And second, it has very unusual branching and bark. Now we can see a little bit on the left-hand slide of how almost twisted the branches look up there. What that doesn't show is the flat or even downward sloping branches that some black gums have. This one doesn't necessarily have that. But on the right-hand side, you can see the bark, which as the tree ages, that corky texture gets very, very deep. You can really bury your fingers about 4 inches in the cracks in between those cork layers. It's always, when I first show this to people who've never seen these older black gums, that's one of the features that always impresses them. And this is looking up at that same tree, and you get an idea of how the branches almost look like a little bit like corkscrews from the ground when you look up. But again, this doesn't show you the flat branching that is also quite common in many gums. But this is one of those trees when you're walking down into a wetland and you look at the upper parts of the crown from a little bit of slope, you can see that odd branching and you say, what is that? That's a different tree. It just shows up. So here's a close-up of the branches, and you can see that it actually has spur branches like apple trees have, and the spur branches come off at a 90-degree angle. Those 90-degree angles are all the way around the twig. So it kind of looks zigzagged and twisted, and that's what ends up as that branch matures, giving it that odd appearance. This is an interesting tree from a lot of perspectives. Here again, they're found primarily in these basin swamps as you move inland in New Hampshire. And they have the ability to just survive in these very harsh conditions where the site is flooded for most of the winter. There's very little soil to speak of. Sometimes they're growing.
Oh, Phil?
Stick with it for a long time. One of the black gum in a basin swamp in Northwood was cored by the Heritage Foundation, Natural Heritage in New Hampshire, and aged at 625 years. And at that time, I think it still is for that matter, the oldest deciduous tree that was ever cored east of the Mississippi River. So, very old tree hanging in there. And on the Stonehouse Forest property that Selt now owns, there's a pretty significant basin swamp. It's about 9 acres in extent, which is large for those. And I know we've led a number of tours in there. If folks haven't seen it, it is worth seeing if Selt ever does a tour in there again in the coming years. And as part of the work we did on looking at that property, we had some of those trees cored, and they were over 500 years old, the older ones. This tree's been used for some things, but its wood is notoriously difficult to work with. It's impossible to split it. And yet that feature was something that the colonists recognized. If you're ever down on Martha's Vineyard, you'll see that this tree is called the beetle bung tree. Kind of an odd name, but that's a mix of really two things. The beetle was a long-handled mallet, and they would use black gums for the pounding side of the mallet because the wood just wouldn't split. So it was used for driving in trunnels in frame construction buildings. The trunnel being that circular tree nail is, the peg that holds the beams together. And the bung is that tapered, flat-sided piece of wood that goes into a barrel in the hole in the barrel to keep the liquid from seeping out. So it's a wood that wouldn't crack, wouldn't split, and it was used for that purpose because it wouldn't leak if you put it in there as the bung. Okay, Fred.
All right. One other fact about black gum. If you're in one of these basin swamps in the fall, black gum has a very brilliant, bright scarlet leaf. They're really quite beautiful in the fall before the leaves fall off. And we had a question about what does coring mean. There's an instrument called an increment borer. They come in a variety of lengths where you can actually twist the increment borer into the tree, and then it creates, there's a hole in it, and then you have a slide that you put in to the increment borer, pull out the slide, and it will have a core, a small core that will show the annual growth rings, and that's how we age trees. So the next tree on our list is American elm. It's one of my favorite trees. Unfortunately, like the beech tree, there are very few elms that American elms that exist today that are in good shape because of the Dutch elm disease, which was a disease that was brought in on nursery stock. The first wave of Dutch elm disease, I think, was in the late 20s, early 30s, wiped out the majority of American elms that existed. New Haven, Connecticut was called the Elm City. If you look at old photographs of a lot of cities in the United States, the major street tree was the American elm. It grew in anaerobic soils. It was probably the best street tree of its time, and unfortunately, most of those were killed in the first wave. And occasionally, we do get another wave. I mean, I have seen perfectly healthy elm trees, and the next thing you know, within a few years, they're dead. The disease is vectored by the elm bark beetle, very similar to the, well, it's a bark beetle rather than a scale insect. So it gets into the dead wood and then infects the tree. But the tree itself, if you look at the picture on the left, the typical term for the shape of an elm tree is vase-shaped. You can see that it starts narrow at the bottom and then it spreads out almost like a flower vase at the top. That's a very unique shape when you're looking to identify an elm tree. If you look at the center picture where my glove is, you'll notice that the buds are sharp and pointed. They almost sit flat against the twig as opposed to sticking out or lateral like the black gum. But you'll notice that the buds will basically stay very close. And again, it has a pseudo-terminal bud at the top. The picture on the right is a good representation of a young elm tree. It has sort of a flaky bark, but not an exfoliating bark. Really, Phil, you got a better definition for that? Okay, so
Well,
all right.
yeah, I think folks that saw the white oak bark in our previous presentation might sort of compare it to that. It's about the same color, but it doesn't, you know, if we had them side by side, I think you'd see the differences, but it's a very light gray.
The one of the defining characteristics of the twigs of an American elm is notice the zigzag pattern of the branch of the twig. It actually, you know, you'll have a bud on one side, then it'll go up, the bud will be on the other side. And this is a very distinguishing characteristic of American elm. If you happen to find a leaf in the when they leaf out, American elm has a leaf that almost feels like sandpaper. It's a very rough texture to the elm leaf. The other thing, if you can find them, the seed of an American elm looks like a fried egg. It's a round disc with the seed right in the middle, and they will fly through the air for quite a distance. Let's see, the picture on the right, that's a pretty good example of what a pole-sized or small diameter, a small saw-log diameter elm looks like. Again, the flaky bark is another thing to look for.
Let me just add that this is another tree that we think about sight when we're looking for it in nature, and you really don't find elm trees on dry sites. They like rich, moist sites, and sometimes we'll find them in red maple swamps growing right along with the red maple. They're very tolerant of wet sites. And you might ask yourself, well, how can a tree that's tolerant of wet sites be a tree that we then planted as a shade tree? Well, it just so happens that some of the characteristics of trees that grow on these wet sites make them better adapted for growing in a concrete or paved area because they're adapted to those anaerobic conditions. Their roots can tolerate low oxygen or no oxygen periods of the year. And they can also deal with the heavy soils that some of these wetlands have, very impermeable almost conditions during the summer months when things dry up there. We're now seeing black gum used as an ornamental tree as well, because also it has that beautiful foliage, but it's tolerant of those tough sites and it has that unique form. All right, on to the aspens, and we just clump these together. We'll talk about how you can differentiate them, but very often when we're working or folks are looking at aspen, we just say it's aspen, or the locals will say popple, which is short for poplar. Not to be confused with tulip poplar, a southern tree, but aspens, poplars, these are the northern ones. The most common being trembling aspen. The photo on the left shows you that cream-colored bark on a younger tree. And this is a tree like pin cherry that is noted for growing very, very fast. We've got another tree here that's both species of aspen, trembling and bigtooth, are early successional. They're tied into the first forests that come into either heavily disturbed sites or clear cuts or fire sites, those kinds of things. So that tree on the left is actually quite young, even though it's tall and may have a decent diameter. I'll bet that isn't more than, say, 15 years old. But even on older trees, and the one on the right is a bigtooth aspen, one of the ways you can identify it in a forest, and bigtooth aspen has the ability to live longer than trembling, is if you tilt your head back, you're still going to see that unusual cream-colored bark on the upper part of it. Don't know that that slide shows it very well for you folks, but that's what we're trying to show. Young stems, again, that cream color is all the way up and down, and Fred is standing next to a tree on the Burley property where we did a clear cut of about 14 acres where there was a lot of trembling aspen. And the idea was to try to regenerate that because it has a very high value for wildlife. And it was really successful, but that tree that Fred is holding on to is about 5 years old. And I bet Fred, it must be 30 feet tall, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
After the first year of growth, the sprouts, the root suckers from those trees were 6 or 7 feet tall on average. This is a tree, trembling aspen anyway, which is one of the most widespread, in fact, it is the most widespread tree in North America. We have very few of our species go from coast to coast. Trembling aspen is one of them. So if you look at its range, it goes pretty far north and it goes right across Canada, excuse me. And of course you see it as you drive through the Rocky Mountains. This is the tree that looks, the bark there on the aspen, and by my eye, is much lighter than the bark that we have. It looks a bit like white birch, which is not found there. So those light colored trees that you see in the Rockies, they're pretty famous for their fall foliage, though it's nothing compared to ours, I think. But anyway, that's all aspen that you're looking at. And trembling aspen is the species. Bigtooth aspen has a much more restricted range. It's pretty much just in the Northeast.
We have a couple questions, Phil. At the Piscasset Greenway, is the big recent cut aspen? Do you know?
The big recent what?
The recent cut. The trees that were recently cut.
So at the Piscasset Greenway, there has been some recent work, which is a follow-up to work that was done 10 years ago or so. And that area that was cut again was aspen. And the whole plan there is to regenerate aspen in really dense stands. We don't have a lot of that in southeastern New Hampshire. And when we see it, we try to manage for that. If you just let things go over time, the aspen will be replaced by mid-successional and late successional trees such as the pines and oaks. And that's what would be there at the Piscasset Greenway. So that's about a 25-acre area that we're managing there for early successional habitat. The keystone species is woodcock, but because of the work we've done in there, what's getting carried in with the woodcock are a lot of other species that have to have that early successional habitat.
Great, and there's a couple of follow-up questions about the differences between the aspen. So our bigtooth and trembling aspen are not the same species, correct?
They are different species, and bigtooth, if you're dealing with a stem that is very small, look for gray hairs, pretty dense hairs on bigtooth. The bud's a little bigger, but the hair on the buds can help you to differentiate it. Trembling aspen, the buds are hairless and shiny. That's about it. You're going to almost always run into trembling over much more than bigtooth. Obviously, the leaves are easy to tell apart because of the size of the teeth. When they say bigtooth, they really are much bigger dentation on the edge of the leaf.
And is trembling aspen the same as quaking aspen?
Yes, it is. And it's called that because the petiole has a flat side that catches the wind and makes the leaf flutter. So that's really what the name's all about.
And are poplar and aspen the same thing? Are those synonymous as well?
That's right. Yeah. So again, poplar is the same as aspen, and a lot of locals will just say popple and get rid of the AR on the end of it. So you'll hear that as well. I'm guilty of that sometimes.
And then I think the last question about the aspens that we have so far is, does it have a smelly wood? Does it have a smell to it?
Well, there's a very strong negative smell in the springtime when the sap starts to run. If you are cutting aspen or scrape the bark off, it's really not a pleasant smell at all. So if you work around it during that season, particularly, you're going to find out what they're talking about. So, but this time of year, I don't think of it as having much of any scent at all.
Great.
All right?
Thanks.
On to willows.
Okay, just a quick, there was another question. Yes, the petiole is the stem of the leaf. That was a question I just saw. And another side note, quaking and bigtooth aspen are also related to cottonwood, eastern cottonwood. And along some of our major rivers like the Connecticut River, especially further south, you'll find whole stands of cottonwood and silver maple growing in the riparian areas adjacent to like the Connecticut or Farmington rivers further south. And the bud of a cottonwood is very large, but it's also very sticky. You'll find that if you find a tree that has a very thick furrowed bark and you can reach the branch and you feel the bud and it's very sticky to the touch, it's probably an eastern cottonwood. So our next species is willow. There are several different types of willow. There's weeping willow, black willow, crack willow, but we're lumping them all together because it's not a tree that you would find very often in the upland forest. They do grow near wetlands and in riparian areas. It's a very weak wooded tree. They tend to get to a certain size and then ice and snow and storms start making them fall apart. You can see the picture on the left that you have a willow growing in a clump. This is very common. There are quite a few willows right along North River Road in Epping at the Burley Farm, where you could see large examples of a willow. The bottom picture on the right is a weeping willow. I guess I would consider one of the more common willows. They leaf out early in the spring. They tend to hold their leaves for longer, but you can see that the branching is exactly what it says. It looks like it's weeping. And so you'd find these planted in a lot of areas. Windbreaks, they use them as windbreaks. Which willows are native? Well, black willow, crack willow are native species. I'm not sure where weeping willow originated, but it's widely distributed throughout the eastern United States. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, there are a lot of shrub willows, pussy willow being one of them, but there are so many that at least when I learned botany and dendrology, we just learned to call it a willow, and it was SPP, because differentiating them required someone with a lot of expertise and a microscope and taking the flower into the lab. But I think generally some of the things I look at are, if it's weeping, it's the introduced one. And I think they were Asian in origin, if I'm not mistaken. A lot of yellow on the twigs makes me think, ooh, we might be looking at an introduced species. But black willow, which is our more native one, a common native one, it's definitely a wetland species. I've seen it growing right in right into the water and beaver flowages, and the twigs are upright. You see the shoots coming out of the trunk and the upper shoots. And I was showing what I think is a native one here in a speckled alder thicket, fairly close to a roadway here. And that's typical of willow. It's, but the other thing, if you remember if folks were taking part in our slide, the first part of our slideshow, all willows have an unusual bud scale in that the buds are covered by a single protective scale. Just one scale covers the whole bud. And a little bit later in the winter, if you grab a hold of that bud scale with your thumb and index fingernails and pull on it, it'll slide off, and you'll see the catkin, the flower, that pussy willow sort of looking thing. It might be green if it's not a pussy willow, but that will be on those lateral buds, which gives it away. So these are related to the aspens, are all in the Salicaceae family, and they all have very similar traits in that they're built to be able to be broken off. They often grow in harsh sites, sprout very vigorously from the stumps and the roots. All right. On to sassafras.
Before
Yes.
we move on, someone is asking which of the willows around here are native. I know you named a couple, but
Yeah, and Fred and I are hedging on that because there have been so many planted willows and they're so difficult to tell apart that we don't do it. But if you're way out in the woods and you're in a wetland and you see a big willow tree growing out in the swamp, I think you can assume here in New Hampshire, it's black willow. We're pretty far north in ranges to be confused with some of the more southern ones. But there are a lot of shrub willows, just smaller trees like pussy willow, smaller shrubs, I'm sorry, that never develop into tree size at all. Okay, on to sassafras. This is not a very common tree in New Hampshire. Again, we're at the northern edge of this tree's range. We find it a lot more in central and southern New England and points south of that. And it does grow quite a bit further west. These are photos from our Mast Road property rather. And where this tree is very, very common. It likes those kind of wetland soils where it's wet for only part of the year and dries out. And you also will find it on relatively sandy sites. And Mast Road property has a lot of that. So it's quite common there. It has unusual corky bark. Sorry for the quality of these photos, but that's what we were trying to show here. And Fred is leaning on one that is fairly typical of what I would say is one of the larger sizes that we tend to see in our region for sassafras. It can get much larger than this. I have measured some of the state champion sassafrasses, but usually we see them as a 6 or 8 inch tree max. The twigs are pretty unusual. During the growing season, they're very green, and that green flushes out. Those are chloroplasts. The twigs themselves have the ability to do some photosynthesis, and it is as common with trees and shrubs that have those in their stems. Over the winter months, the chloroplasts die off, and then you see the deeper reddish color, which is a different chemical coming through that's masked from our eyesight during the growing season. So they have this more deep red color. And you can see down near Fred's glove that there are these odd lenticels that look like blotches on the trunk. They're heavily speckled with those lenticels. Sassafras is a pretty interesting tree. Every part of it has a strong, pleasant odor. It's been used for lots of things. It was used a lot by Native Americans, and it was used by the colonists who learned from the Native Americans, and then we started doing some unusual things with it. The roots and bark of the roots was extracted. It was one of the earliest exports from colonial America, and it was used for all kinds of things for a long time into the 20th century. They would make all these heal-all syrups that had great promises of curing everything. And sassafras oil was part of that. The interesting thing is that sassafras oil does have some good chemical properties for healing some things. It was used as a treatment for a number of diseases by doctors for a long time. And that's one of the reasons that it was exported to Europe early. So interesting tree, and you'll find a lot of it on the Mass Road property if you want to get familiar with it. The leaf is, which we don't see in the winter, is one of those interesting features. Our North American species has a leaf that either looks like a mitten or has 2 fingers and a main lobe in the middle, or no lobes at all, and just an entire, looks like the palm of my hand without any lobes. So it's an interesting, very interesting leaf.
We had a
Before,
question. Go ahead, Zoe.
well, you probably know how to pronounce this word better than I. We have a question asking to explain allelopathy.
Oh, allelopathic relationship. Sorry, and we should have mentioned that with black walnut as well. This is a, well, let me back up. If you think about what plants are doing in the wild, they're competing for sunlight, moisture, and nutrients. And it's not a game. They are trying to kill their competitors. And so they've evolved a number of tricks to deal with that. One is to grow very fast and to shade out your competitors and those sorts of things. But some of the plants have developed chemical ways to deal with their competitors. And so sassafras is one of those. It has a way that the leaves and the roots give off a chemical that helps it compete by killing off its neighbors or stunting their growth. Black walnut's famous for this, though I think they're showing now that it's more the husks of the fruit that are more problematic with black walnut than the rest of the parts of the plant. But sassafras you'll find in thickets because the roots and the leaves give off a chemical that inhibits the growth of other plants. Kind of a cool way. Some of the ferns are very good at doing this. Hay-scented fern, if you have it growing on your property, it comes into disturbed sites. Hay-scented fern is a strong allelopathic competitor, and it will keep trees and shrubs and all kinds of other plants. It'll really inhibit their growth for decades if it can, and will just be a pure stand of hay-scented fern. Thanks for that. That was a good question. Sorry, I skimmed over that.
That's okay. There's actually a follow-up to it. Is Norway maple also allelopathic, and garlic mustard? Can you comment on garlic mustard?
I don't know about garlic mustard, but Norway maple, to the best of my knowledge, is not. Norway maple is an introduced tree, and it was planted very, very widely as a replacement shade tree because it's more tolerant of road salt than our native sugar maple, which has really been severely affected by road salt applications in the Northeast. And it was a great tree. It fit the purpose, but unfortunately, it has the nasty habit of reproducing widely. And we now are seeing it in woodlots in southeastern New Hampshire, all over the state, really, but in close proximity to cities or more urban areas, we're seeing it spreading out there. So it's been listed as an invasive species, and we don't recommend planting it anymore. I'm not sure if you can even buy it anymore. Can you, Fred, in New Hampshire?
No, it's on the prohibited list.
Okay.
But I have read where Norway maple does have some allelopathic tendencies. It's very difficult to grow grass under a Norway maple, and I think that's a combination of the heavy foliage and chemicals in the root system.
Interesting. I hadn't heard that, so I'll take back my statement. We don't see that though in a forested setting. It doesn't seem to affect other trees. Interesting.
Yeah. All right, on to basswood, another one of my favorite trees. And this is also a tree that is particularly liked by those who carve decoys. It has a very malleable wood that's easily worked. You're not going to find basswood growing on a ledgy upland or sandy soil. It requires a good, deep, rich soil. I find it a lot in draws and coves where soil has been able to gather. You might also find it in near a riparian area. I wouldn't say in a riparian area like red maple, but you would find it growing close by it. It needs a good source of water. As it says here, the bark is dark gray, relatively smooth in upper sections of the trunk. It's furrowed, as you can see where I'm standing next to it. It's very furrowed. It's often double trunked, where there may have been a tree and it was cut or died for some reason, and then it's sprouted from the root collar around the stump. The twigs have a very large pseudo-terminal bud, probably one of the largest pseudo-terminal buds that I have seen. It's not a major species component in New Hampshire, but I've seen them individually on quite a few woodlots that I have visited in Rockingham County. When the foliage is out, it has a very large heart-shaped leaf with an uneven base. One side of the base is higher up on the petiole or stem than the other side, but it has one of the largest leaves of any of the species of trees that we have in New England and New Hampshire.
I don't know if you want to, I can't read the questions here, so if somebody reads them to me. There was something about, yes?
Well, so there are quite a few multi-trunk 3 to 5-ish trees that Leslie here assumed were oaks at the Piscasset Greenway. Could those be basswood? Or if their oak is multi-trunk from multiple acorns or just split at the trunk?
Yeah, so multiple trunks on deciduous trees are usually caused by browsing. So a deer, or they could be caused by a tree being harvested or cut or damaged and broken off in some kind of an incident. And so the tree sprouted from the stump or from low down in the trunk, and you ended up with a number of different sprouts coming off from the same root system. Basswood does that. The unusual thing about basswood is that it does it on its own. That's the trait that's unusual. It isn't necessarily from browsing. So if you look at those two trees that Fred's standing next to, that's from the same root system, and why it doubles up, we don't understand. And this other photo on the right side, there's actually 3 coming out from one. One is much smaller. I haven't ever had that explained to me why basswood tends to do that, but it's one of their defining traits. It isn't always like that though. You can find individual basswoods that are really outstanding trees. Okay, on to white pine. We couldn't do, we're going to switch over now, by the way, to the evergreens or conifers. We broke this apart that way. So we couldn't do this without covering white pine. This is a tree that folks that live in the Northeast should be able to identify at 65 miles an hour. You know it because it's the most common conifer that we have, and very often in forest settings, it's the king of the forest. It's not unusual at all to see it standing taller than the rest of the trees around it. That's one of the traits of this tree. This is one of the reasons that actually New Hampshire and Maine were settled. It certainly wasn't for our soils. The British were coming after these trees for mast for their ships. They had run out of their supply. And it was one of the first things we exported. We were exporting white pine trunks for masts to be used by other navies in the 1600s from coastal New Hampshire. So yeah, again, it should be a nice, straight, tall tree, and the trunk, as it matures, the bark on it has pretty thick, corky bark. It actually acts like a radiator to help temper, hot and cold weather. I think we covered that a bit when we were talking about white birch. The needles of pines, all the pines, the Pinaceae, are held together in clusters. That's a group of needles that are joined together in one place on the twig. And white pine has clusters of 5. So it's what's called a 5-needle pine. And there are a number of different 5-needle pines. One of the common things that we see in white pines throughout its range, this is a native insect problem, is that this little beetle, the white pine weevil, attacks the top of the tree when it's young. And you can see that in this center slide. This young pine, it's about 8 feet high, has had one part of it already attacked and dead in the middle. And I can see from this discoloration that this new shoot that termed up, that also has been attacked because this is off color up here. This is not uncommon at all when white pine has the ability to come into old fields, and it's often called a pioneer for that reason. So it mimics and is often called an early succession species. But I'll cover that in a second. It slides into other successional stages over time. But the effect of having white pine weevil, let me finish that story, is that you end up with white pines looking like the one on the left and the one on the right, often called cabbage or bull pines. It's been estimated that well over 75% of all standing white pine that comes into old fields or openings is affected by this insect, which causes quite a degrade in the quality of products that, forest products that you can get from that, because the tree is very crooked and limby, and you can't really make great lumber out of it if that's what you're interested in doing. But they are artistic, I'll say that. Let's see. There's a lot of things we could say about white pine. It's an absolutely staggeringly important tree to the forest industry's economy in northern New England, and its range is extensive. It goes way up into Canada, and it continues to be a tree that supports all kinds of things. It's also quite important for wildlife. This is another tree that we talked a little bit about mast seed production the last time. And this year, you may have noticed, particularly if you got them around your yard and you had to rake them up, that it was a heck of a banner year for pine cone production this year. And white pine is one of those trees that it every once in a while, every 7 to 10 years, it will start to produce bumper crops of cones. It's not really known exactly why that's triggered. There are a few theories on it. But at any rate, they'll pump out and they might have cone production for 3 years in a row max, and then it'll go quiet for another 7 to 10 years and then do it again. One of the interesting theories about why that happens is certain species like the pines and oaks have developed that to keep the predators that rely on them as food at bay. So if they produced a lot of acorns or a lot of pine cones every year, the theory is that the animals that would feed on them would just continue to develop more and more of them, and they would never, these species wouldn't have a good chance of reproducing. So by pulsing their seed production, or fruit production, I should say, at these irregular intervals, it causes the predators that depend on them to collapse in between. That's one of the theories. Seems to work. And on to red pine.
Okay, another one of my favorite species. But before I do, as foresters, when we're trying to manage white pine, one of the methods that we use is to try to grow it in partial shade to prevent the attack from the white pine weevil. The weevil goes after the highest illuminated point on the white pine, hence the terminal dying and then the lateral branches trying to become the terminals. So when it's very young, white pine is semi-shade tolerant. As it gets older, it becomes less shade tolerant. So it's a balancing act between trying to grow it in the partial shade of either other white pine or other species. And we try to get at least that first 16-foot log straight and before, so that we can get at least one good log out of a pine tree before the potential attack by the weevil. Red pine is another native pine. It has been widely planted because it is a fast-growing pine, especially when it's young. So back in the CCC days of the 30s and into the 50s, a lot of red pine was planted throughout New England. A lot of the water companies would use red pine around their reservoirs to keep the organic deciduous leaf matter out of their reservoirs. But red pine, the bark has a very different shade, color, and texture than white pine. You can see on the right there that it is a pinkish color. It's very noticeable. Next slide. And as somebody has already pointed out, red pine is a 3-needle pine. If you look at the needles in my hand, you'll see that each cluster is 3, fairly long, 5 to 7 inches long. The clusters are included in what's called a fascicle. So the fascicle is what holds the needles together. And I had noticed somebody on the chat had already mentioned that red pine is 3-needle. One of the, when I took dendrology, another story about my school days, Austrian pine is an introduced pine, and it's also a 3-needle pine. And my professor told us that if you were to take the needle from a red pine or from a 3-needle pine and put it up to your neck, if the needle bent, it was red pine. If it stuck in your neck, it was Austrian pine. So the red pine has a very flexible, long needle.
They teach them different in Massachusetts. Right?
Yeah, yeah, they don't teach that at UNH.
That explains why you have those little marks on your neck.
What'd you say, Phil?
That explains why you have those little marks on your neck.
Yeah, right. Yeah, the marks, and you can see by the beech behind the red pine in this picture.
Okay, another Another one of this group that we call the hard pines, pretty much all of the southern pines, red pine, and this one, pitch pine. This is a group that we often call hard pines. The white pine and its relatives, we often call a soft pines. And I think as much as anything, that defines the wood properties, but it also reflects how the branches bend when they're faced with ice and snow and all that, and how the trees have adapted to either shedding the snow or carrying the load. And these hard pines tend to carry it. So this is pitch pine. Pitch pine, very different from the other two. You can see just from its shape on the left that it's, unlike red pine, it's not usually a straight tree at all. It's usually quite twisted. And this is a tree that we tend to think of growing in harsh places. So it's either going to be very dry and in a site that is prone to fire. And this is often a fire associated tree. It's often how it reproduces. Or we might find it, as that slide on the left shows, and this is from the Mast Road property again. Here it's growing in a fen, which is, a fen is very similar to a bog. So it's growing out on a peat mat, floating bog here, very little of what you might really call true soil. And it's not that unusual to see pitch pine in the southern part of the state growing on those sites as well. So very dry sites that might be prone to fire, abandoned gravel pits. The tree of Cape Cod, if you drive out Cape Cod, it's pretty much pitch pine and a lot of white oak and scrub oak. The picture on the right shows you one of the unusual traits of pitch pine, and that's that it has epicormic or sprouts that come out of the trunk. These are from usually dormant buds on most trees, but on pitch pine, they tend to sprout out and persist. And that's very, very unusual for conifers. We don't see that on them. For deciduous trees, that's actually the norm. But on conifers, you don't find sprouts that can help the tree to survive incidents like a major fire or some kind of an episode that damages the top of the tree. That's what they're designed to do. The other thing that we see on pitch pine that's interesting is that the cones can persist for a long, long time on there. So we'll see, if we look up into the crown, we'll see cones that are fresh from this year. And then we'll see cones from many years before that. And those are called serodness cones because the term refers to slow to mature. It might not only apply to cones, by the way. Sometimes it's used for other botanical features of a plant. But in this case, we're talking about serodness cones, which are adapted again to open up at the right condition. So even those older cones on pitch pine might be closed tight and they might have never opened and they've just been waiting for the right incident. A hot fire will help dry them out quickly and open them, or really hot weather in the summer, a drought, that kind of thing can do the trick. This is a close-up of the needles, twigs. This is a 2-needle pine, isn't it, Fred, if I remember right?
Yes.
I never use the needle clump count to identify plants, but anyway, yeah, it's a 2-needle pine and very short needles compared to red and much shorter even than white.
Before we go on to Eastern Red Cedar, I'd like to go back to red pine for just a second. One of the things I didn't mention about red pine is that unfortunately, red pine is susceptible to a scale insect called the Matsococcus scale. We started seeing this in Connecticut in the early 1980s, before a lot of you young people were born. But unfortunately, growing trees in a monoculture is not a good idea, because if you have a disease or an insect that affects the species, if you plant it in a monoculture, which was done with red pine, you're going to lose all of the trees within a relatively short period of time. For those of you who have been to Bear Brook in Allenstown, red pine scale or Matsukaka scale was found in Bear Brook, I believe it was 2014, and they ended up salvaging about 2 million board feet of red pine from the state park. If you drive up Route 106 through Loudon, you will see standing dead red pine. One of the things we look for, or the thing that we look for, is it's called the flagging. What'll happen is the lower branches, the needles will turn a burnt orange, and then the branch will droop. And that is a sure sign that your red pine has been infected by the red pine scale. They feed under the bark scales. It's very difficult to control. There are no herbicides that you can use, pesticides that you can use to control it. And so it's been most of the state parks in southern New Hampshire, they have eliminated or removed the red pine. So just something for those of you who are forest landowners who are considering putting in plantations of trees, make sure that you use a mix of species. Don't just plant one species.
Before we move on to eastern red cedar, we have a couple questions about the white pine. Someone was wondering about what the later successional niche for white pine is.
Yeah, I didn't really finish that. So white pine, we like to think of trees falling into a nice, neat box of successional stages, like pin cherry as an example. Pin cherry is always an early successional tree, grows very fast, starts to reproduce at a young age, but dies out by age 20 or 30. But white pine, it fits the early successional mode because it has the ability and is very often found as a pioneer, particularly on abandoned farmland. It's one of the few species that can compete well with the grasses. And so we find it going into these old fields. But on the other side of it, it can live for 200 plus years, maybe 300 plus years. So white pine, we find in virtually every successional stage. It's pretty shade tolerant, and yet it loves full sunlight. It can grow really fast, or it can just hunker down and grow slowly, and it grows on a lot of sites. Excuse me. So it doesn't fit the mold, and we find really that for a lot of species, that mold, it's not as black and white as we would hope.
Great. And then Sarah's wondering, she's been seeing a reddish film on white pines lately, and it's only on one side of the bark. Do you know what that is? Off the
Did
top
you
of your
say
head?
a reddish film?
Yeah.
No, I don't know if maybe Fred does, but it doesn't ring a bell with me.
No, I don't. The other major disease that I know that's affecting white pine is a disease called caliciopsis. And it, in unthinned, crowded white pine stands that don't get good air circulation, you'll start to get these black blisters at the branch nodes. And that's been in the state for about probably close to 10 years now. But a red film, I'm not exactly sure what that is.
Yeah.
Oh.
Okay.
What I hope it's not is blister rust. Blister rust is a disease that requires two hosts, ribes, gooseberries, currants, and white pine. And you would find reddish blisters, again, around the branch nodes. But it's not very common. That was another thing that the CCCs did during the 30s, was to pull out all of the gooseberry and currant bushes in New England because the disease needed the co-host. But I have seen it in Connecticut, and that's the only other disease. What I would suggest is contact your local cooperative extension forester or Kyle Lombard, the forest health specialist with the Division of Forests and Lands, and ask one or the other to take a look at those trees, because white pine blister rust is a very serious disease of white pine trees.
Okay.
We're-
Is this,
yeah, I just wanted to let people know, I see that there are a couple more questions, but we're running out of time and we still have a few to go. So let's, we will either get to you at the end or follow up in the follow-up email, but we'll make sure you get your questions answered. But let's
okay.
Okay, Eastern red cedar. Eastern red cedar is a small tree, probably 40 to 50 feet tall. It is in the juniper family. It is very closely related to juniper. If you look at the needles on the right, the new growth, the new needles are very sharp and spiky, but as they mature, they do flatten out. If you were to grab the new growth on an Eastern red cedar, you would definitely know it. They do have a shaggy bark. The branches persist, as you can see from the tree on the left. The branches do persist for quite a long time. The heartwood of Eastern red cedar is reddish to purplish. It's a very, very, very sweet smell. It's very rot resistant, and it's used a lot in hope chests and jewelry chests and things like that. Go ahead, Phil.
Okay, on to Eastern hemlock. This is another one of our most common trees. And I think that most of you are familiar with it. Fred, standing under a fairly typical small to medium sized one. When they're healthy, you would expect that hemlocks would have live branches almost down to the ground. This is a tree that has extreme tolerance to shade. It can live in the understory like this for literally centuries and sort of wait until one of the trees over the top of it dies and then make its move to get up into dominance in the forest. If you flip the twigs, the branches over and look at the underside, the needles have two parallel white lines. And that shows on the twig on the right. It's pretty easy to identify it. The needles are singly attached to the twigs. So unlike the pines, you don't have the fascicle, you have each needle attached by itself. And here they're attached in a flattened spray. So they come off each side of that twig in a flat arrangement. The bark of hemlock is reddish brown, sort of like the color of leather. And that's not by coincidence, because the bark of hemlock has a very high tannin content and was traditionally used for a long, long time in the tanning process for tanning leathers and giving them that color. And a lot of the leather tanning took place in eastern and northeastern United States. Trees were harvested, cut down, and they would just peel the bark off from them, even if they didn't have any use for the rest of the trunk. And they would send the bark off to tanneries to dye the leather and treat the leather. One of the huge problems, another introduced pest, we seem to be just talking about them in this presentation, and one that we're really worried about with this species are these two things, the hemlock woolly adelgid, and along with it, this elongated or elongate hemlock scale. The big one on this, though, is the HWA, or hemlock woolly adelgid, and this is another introduced pest. We first spotted it in Portsmouth in the year 2000, and since then it's spread all over the state. We were hoping for a long time that it was going to be held in abeyance roughly at the Massachusetts border, because our winter temperatures used to be cold enough. Our low lows were cold enough, 0 would often be a winter temperature we'd reach. And that, if we do get to 0, it tends to wipe out the infestation for that year. The problem is this unusual insect, and an adelgid is like an aphid, and very closely related to the aphids. They come back in with the migrating songbirds in the spring. So the neotropical migrants come back up, and they've done in their birding surveys in the spring, they can see that many of the neotropical migrants have hemlock woolly adelgid clustered onto their legs. So they transport it right back into forests. So what we're seeing is this adelgid is really damaging hemlocks. And we know south of here, where Fred worked in Connecticut, and over in Pennsylvania, where the insect's been longer and the climate's just slightly warmer, that eventually it starts to wipe out the mature hemlocks. It takes a while, but slowly but surely the insect does its job, and the scale insect comes in behind it usually. So it's a 1-2 punch. When the woolly adelgid has come in, the tree gets weakened, the scale comes in, and it finishes the trees off. So we're concerned about what this is going to do to what's really a very important tree from many aspects in the state and in northern New England, and how it's going to change our forests. This is one that's now moving a lot faster than we thought.
So Zoe, we've only got 4 more trees to go through. Can we just go over a little bit?
That's fine by me. Yeah, I'm here all day. You guys, it's up to you. I just didn't want to.
Let's just crank these out, Fred, and then we can take maybe a few questions.
Okay.
Sounds
All
good.
right. The next one on our list is red spruce. The red spruce is a native tree to New Hampshire. You don't find a lot of it in southern New Hampshire, but I was up on Saddleback Mountain yesterday in Deerfield doing some boundary line maintenance, and I found quite a few red spruce in the understory. Just to give you the particulars, the needles on red spruce are 4-sided. They're yellowish green in color, as you can see in the picture here. One of the characteristics of spruce trees is that the needles grow on little pegs off of the twig, versus fir trees where the needles grow directly from the twig. Another good characteristic when you're dealing with spruce versus fir is that, if you can remember, the cones on a fir tree point up, the cones on a spruce tree hang down. Next.
And black spruce, and this is right on the Stonehouse Forest property on a pretty extensive fen. There are a few of these on the Stonehouse Forest property. That's the kind of site that we'd expect to see black spruce on. And this is virtually all the spruce trees that you're seeing in this. The bigger conifers, of course, in the background are white pine, but everything else, I think, in this photo that's a conifer is black spruce. It's a much smaller tree. You'll notice that the branches tend, on the right-hand stem, you'll see they tend to slope downward and then tip back up on the ends. So they tend to have that curving look. As with the spruces, the needles are 4-sided. So instead of a flat needle like hemlock and fir, you have a needle that'll roll around between your thumb and index finger. The cones are quite small on black spruce, and they can have persistent cones. So you can look at some of these trees that look like they're not that old, but these are actually very old trees on that fen. And I don't show it here, but some of them have masses of cones from many years before. This is a really uncommon tree in southern New Hampshire. You have to get on a site like this, and you really don't see it much in the coastal region at all.
So white spruce is probably the most common spruce that you would find in southern New Hampshire. A lot of Christmas tree growers grow white spruce as a Christmas tree. It's a relatively fast growing. Again, it's got a four-sided needle. The cones on the white spruce are quite a bit larger than that of the red and the black, and you'll find it growing in a variety of sites. I mean, I've seen it growing on an upland site. I've also seen it growing close to wetlands, but it is a very common species. It's a fairly large tree when it's mature. Go ahead.
And on to balsam fir, and this is the fir that was the first real cultivated tree for Christmas trees. So if you think of that, the fir pillows or the odor of Christmas trees that you used to have in your house when you first started getting them, that's balsam fir. It's still used very widely for Christmas trees, but there are now a lot of other species that have been planted, and like Fraser fir that doesn't have as deep aroma, but has much more beautiful foliage. One of the things about the true firs, the Abies clan, that whole genus, and sorry for the blurry slide here, but the end buds, you see there are 3 buds on the end. All of the true firs, the bud looks like it was dipped in paraffin, in wax. So, and that's a protective coating for the very cold climates that the firs tend to be adapted to. Again, you have flat needles. They might be confused with hemlock, I suppose, but we have a very different tree in total. We have a tree that, again, is really uncommon. In fact, you just don't see it in most of Rockingham. In fact, I can't think of many places at all where you can see it in Rockingham, but you do start to bump into it in the northern parts of Stratford County if you're up in elevation or on the right sites. This is part of that boreal forest mix. And as Fred said, with the firs, the cone is upright, but you don't see the cone in the winter because the cone disintegrates. It's a pretty cool, neat looking cone that it's upright and it just falls apart and the seed gets dispersed that way. Whereas a pine or spruce cone, the bracts lift up and the seed falls off that way. So it's just a different adaptation to how the seed is dispersed. And that's it for our slides. So if we have some quick questions, Zoe, maybe we can answer them.
Yeah, we had a couple back from the cedar and even white pine. So how is a cedar different from juniper?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. So common juniper is the native juniper that we have, and eastern red cedar is very closely related to, they're both juniperous, so they're both in the same genus. And one is just a shrub. It never gets very tall at all. It just sort of trails along the ground. That's common juniper, the shrub. And it tends to only have those prickly, spiky needles that Fred pointed out. And the other one is an upright tree that we showed you, which is eastern red cedar. Both of them, by the way, have what look like berries on them for fruit. They're blue, and we often call them cedar berries or blue colored berries. The ones on eastern red cedar, by the way, are used to help flavor gin. So you get an idea that they're not terribly palatable, but they are used for something. Those are actually cones. This is a conifer, and they're a very unusual cone in that they have that fleshy sort of growth around the cone itself. There are just two seeds in there. That makes them very attractive to birds, by the way. Cedar waxwings absolutely love eastern red cedar, the berries we call them. And it's been shown that when when the cone has gone through the bird's digestive tract, the seed covering has been decomposed a little bit, and they have a much higher germination rate because of that, which isn't unusual in the plant world to rely on birds or mammals or other animals, their digestive tracts to help speed up or improve the ability for the seed to sprout.
The other thing about red cedar, again, going back to diseases, red cedar is a co-host for apple cedar rust. And you might find these orange gooey growths on a red cedar. And it's, I don't know if that's is that what releases the spores that affect apple trees or? Yeah,
Yeah, it is.
yeah, yeah.
And they're quite large,
Yeah.
but they are kind of ghoulish looking things.
Yes, yeah.
Great. Someone else is wondering, do Western conifer seed bugs prefer white pines?
Western conifer what?
Seed bugs?
They prefer my house.
Are those the little, like, they look like dinosaurs almost?
Yeah.
They love my house too.
Yeah, they have quite an odor. Yeah, I think they're one of the cone attackers. I don't know how much effect they're having. That's an introduced species again.
Yeah, I'm not sure either.
And so someone else is asking, is it spruce that has sap pockets under the bark? And does this apply to all spruce in the area?
Well, red spruce is pretty famous for it. I don't know how much the others are, but and I think black has it as well. And those, spruce gum, not that I've ever been a fan of it, is made out of those pitch pockets. I never liked the taste of pitch that much, so I was never a fan, but that's what that's from. The bubbles on balsam, on the trunks of balsam fir, if you look at particularly the young balsam fir, the trunk of it has really what looks like bubbles, and those are filled with a very clear sap. And that actually used to be harvested and used to cement lens covers on slides. Remember when we used to have slides and you had those little thin layers of glass that you would put on a specimen, and it was originally what we were using was a product made out of the sap of balsam because it was so clear and a good quick setting glue for that.
Interesting. So somebody else is wondering why we don't see massive evergreens like they do on the West Coast here.
Great question. Well, this is not any different than why northern New Hampshire has a boreal forest and we don't have it here in southern New Hampshire. And you could say, why is there a tropical forest in the Amazon and not here? There are major climatic differences, number one. Then we've had all the evolution that's taken place that has moved plants south and north over time. And then we have features like the Rocky Mountains. If you're comparing the West Coast to here that have influenced how the plants move north and south. So a whole bunch of factors just have shaped why plants are growing where they are, trees, shrubs, all the native plants. And it's just a mix of things. That's a great question.
To go a little further on that, if you look at like the Olympic Peninsula in Washington and the western slopes of the Cascade Mountains, the Rocky Mountains, you also get the fog that rolls in off of the Pacific Ocean, and trees like the coastal Douglas fir, the redwoods, the sequoias will actually absorb moisture through the foliage in those rainforest situations. So they not only draw in moisture from the ground, they are also using the moisture in the air. So that's another reason why you get larger trees and species like the redwoods, the sequoias. There are differences between coastal Douglas fir and inland Douglas fir, and it's because of one being in the rainforest and the other being in a drier environment.
Great. Well, I don't see any more questions. Does anyone else? Now's your chance. Type them in there. Oh, I have a hand raised. So I'm gonna allow you to talk, Brenda, and you can ask your question live. So here we go. I'm gonna press the button now. Can you hear us, Brenda? Brenda, do you want to ask a question?
I have much more than 10% of my trees are dying. And I'm wondering if anything's going on just on my property or the rest of the state.
Sorry, Brenda, we can barely hear you. If you can speak kind of closer into your computer microphone, that would be helpful.
I don't know where that is, but
if you kind of get your face right up, we can't see you. So if you just
okay.
want to, don't be shy, just get your face right in there.
I have a lot more than 10% of my trees dying. And I'm wondering if that is statewide or just me. I have a oak, ash, pine, white pine area. Southern slope.
Yeah, it's really hard to say, Brenda, what's causing that. If Fred and I used to answer hundreds of these questions a year. And the first thing I would always ask is, if you're talking about a house lot and you're talking about the area immediately around the building area, that's an area where the trees have been highly disturbed. And you may not have done it, but a previous owner to you did it to put in a lawn, to build the house, all that. So if you're talking about that zone and any place along your driveway or along a city street, trees are really, they're totally battered in those locations, and it's tough for them to live a long time, and they very often succumb to something, and their life is shortened because of that. So, those are areas where people look to replace, or they let natural regeneration, which when trees are very young, they get adapted to where they are, and they do much better than a more mature tree in that kind of a site. So I don't know if that explains it, but that'd be my first guess.
Not quite, because I built 40 years ago. And these are fairly large trees that all of a sudden there's no back. And they're, with the storms, they're falling over.
Yeah, without seeing it, I can't give you a good answer.
No, I know. Yeah, I know.
Sorry.
I mean, how, do you have a wood lot? You know, do you have any acreage with your property?
Yes, about, well, I'm right across the street from Beaver Brook and Hollis.
Uh-huh.
And so there's and I've left it as natural as I can. So I haven't been disturbing this area.
I'd suggest getting a hold of your local co-op. What county is Hollis in?
Hillsborough.
I'm sorry?
Hillsborough.
Hillsborough?
Yeah.
I'd get in touch with Mike Gagnon,
Okay.
who's the Hillsborough County Forester in Goffstown.
All right.
If you look up UNH Cooperative Extension Forestry and Wildlife, it would give you the phone number and the contact information for Mike.
That would be good. Thank you. I'm just curious, you know. I'm losing a lot of trees.
Well, thanks, Brenda. I think we have one more question. It looks like a good one to wrap up with. This is from Phil McClure, and he is wondering what the future forests will look like with all the assaults on our most common trees like beech, hemlock, and red pine.
We're asking ourselves that question a lot these days. Yeah, who knows? And and then the other thing is the big one is climate change. So what we would expect is that we would probably have more oak species. White pine will probably continue to do well, but we are really starting to lose a number of species. I mean, it's really hard to say just what's going to happen here, but it looks like even without any other diseases with climate change, the way New Hampshire is oriented, a lot of the species that we're on the edge of that are more northerly, they're going to move north. And while we may not see it in our lifetimes, 50, 100 years from now, we may see sugar maple pretty much vacant from much of the southern part of the state. So I don't know. Yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah.
Scary
They're
one.
now growing loblolly pine on Long Island, and that's a southern pine species. So as Phil said, the southern species will probably move further north, and our species like sugar maple, balsam fir will continue to move north. An interesting side note is I had read once that hemlock actually disappeared from our landscape about 5,000 years ago, and they think it was the elongate scale, but over time, hemlock recolonized this part of New England. And so, we're probably on our, fourth or fifth forest in New Hampshire since colonial days, and it will continue to change. Invasive species will become more prevalent unless we do something to control them. Norway maple, as Phil said, you can now find Norway maple growing in forest stands where it was sugar maple before. So these are things that we need to keep track of and control.
Great. Well, kind of a downer, I guess, at the end there, but important nonetheless. So we will end it there. And for those of you that are still with us, thank you so much for everyone for coming. And I will send out an email with the slides again, with the recording. It does take a little while to process, so it might not be immediately, but I got to download it and stuff. And I'll send out some resources that we talked about, some of the websites that got posted. So expect that from me either later today or early next week. And for those of us that have a 3-day weekend, have a happy weekend. And to Phil and Fred, thank you for everything. That was great.
It was fun.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thanks for having me.
Yep. Thanks for having us. Bye-bye.
Always a pleasure. All right. Thanks all.